In the chronicles of colonial times, few figures loom as large or as dark as King Leopold II of Belgium. His rule over the Congo Free State stands as one of the most brutal chapters in the European colonization of Africa. This is the story of a monarch's insatiable ambition, the suffering of millions, and a legacy that continues to haunt us to this day. Leopold Louis Philippe Marie Victor was born on April 9, 1835 in Brussels, Belgium. He was the second child of Leopold I, the first king of the Belgians, and his second wife, Louise of Orleans. Leopold II birth came at a crucial time for the young Belgian nation. Belgium had only gained its independence from the Netherlands in 1830, and Leopold I, a German prince, had been invited to become the country's first king. The birth of a male heir was seen as a stabilizing factor for the new monarchy. Young Leopold grew up in the royal palace of Laeken, surrounded by luxury and privilege. But his childhood was far from idyllic. Leopold's relationship with his parents was strained. His father was distant and critical, while his mother, though loving, was often in poor health. This lack of warmth in his early years may have contributed to the cold, calculating personality Leopold would later develop. Despite the emotional distance, Leopold I had grand ambitions for his son and heir. The young prince received a rigorous education befitting a future king. Leopold's education was comprehensive and intense. He studied languages, history, mathematics, and sciences. But perhaps most importantly, he was schooled in the arts of statecraft and diplomacy from a very young age. As a child, Leopold showed a keen interest in geography and the wider world beyond Belgium's borders. He would spend hours poring over maps and reading accounts of explorers and adventurers. This early fascination with far-off lands and unexplored territories provides an interesting insight into Leopold's later colonial ambitions. Even as a child, he seemed to be looking beyond the confines of his small kingdom. In 1853, at the age of 18, Leopold was given the title of Duke of Brabant and took his seat in the Belgian Senate. This marked the beginning of his official public life and his preparation for eventual kingship. Leopold's entry into the Senate allowed him to observe and participate in the political life of Belgium. He quickly developed a reputation as an intelligent and ambitious young man, but also one who could be arrogant and dismissive of those he considered his inferiors. On August 22, 1853, Leopold married Marie Henriette of Austria in Brussels. The marriage was arranged for political reasons and would prove to be an unhappy one. Marie Henriette was vivacious and outgoing, while Leopold was reserved and cerebral. They had little in common, and their relationship was strained from the start. This loveless marriage would have a profound impact on Leopold's personal life and, indirectly, on his later actions as king. Despite the personal difficulties, Leopold and Marie Henriette fulfilled their royal duty by producing heirs. They had 4 children: Louise, Leopold, Stephanie, and Clementine. Tragically, their only son, also named Leopold, died at the age of 9 from pneumonia in 1869. The death of his only son was a severe blow to Leopold. It not only caused him personal grief, but also raised concerns about the succession. This loss may have intensified his desire to create a lasting legacy through other means. As the Duke of Brabant, Leopold began to develop his ideas about Belgium's place in the world. He traveled extensively, visiting Egypt, India, and China, among other places. These travels further fueled his colonial ambitions. Leopold was acutely aware that Belgium was a small country, surrounded by powerful neighbors. He believed that for Belgium to prosper and be secure, it needed to expand its influence overseas. His travels in the East convinced him of the potential riches to be gained through colonial ventures. In the years leading up to his ascension to the throne, Leopold became increasingly focused on the idea of acquiring colonial territory for Belgium. He saw this as both a path to personal glory and a means of elevating Belgium's status among European powers. It's important to understand that Leopold's colonial ambitions were not unusual for his time. Many European nations were engaged in imperial expansion. What set Leopold apart was the single-minded determination with which he pursued his goals and the methods he would eventually employ to achieve them. On December 10th, 1865, King Leopold I of Belgium passed away at the age of 74. His death marked the end of an era for the young Belgian nation and the beginning of a new one under his son, now King Leopold II. The transition of power was smooth, as Leopold II had been groomed for this role his entire life. At 30 years old, he was well prepared to take on the responsibilities of kingship, at least in terms of his education and experience. Leopold II's coronation took place on December 17th, 1865, in Brussels. The streets were lined with cheering crowds, hopeful for the reign of their new monarch. It's important to note that the Belgian monarchy was, and still is, largely ceremonial. The real power lay with the elected government. However, Leopold II would prove to be far from a passive figurehead. In his coronation speech, Leopold II outlined his vision for Belgium's future, emphasizing the need for progress, modernization, and expansion. He declared, "Belgium, although small in territory, occupies a large place in the world through her arts, her industry, and her commerce. It is our duty to maintain and extend this high position." This speech gives us a clear indication of Leopold's ambitions. He saw Belgium not just as a small European nation, but as a potential global player. This mindset would drive many of his future actions. In the early years of his reign, Leopold II focused on domestic issues, pushing for military reforms and urban development projects. Leopold II had a grand vision for Brussels. He wanted to transform it into a modern capital that could rival Paris or Vienna. Many of the city's iconic buildings and boulevards were constructed during his reign. However, these ambitious projects came at a significant cost, both financial and social. Leopold's urban renewal often displaced poorer communities, leading to criticism from some quarters. While Leopold's building projects did modernize Brussels, they also exacerbated social inequalities. The king seemed more concerned with grand facades than with the living conditions of ordinary Belgians. Despite these domestic initiatives, Leopold's gaze was increasingly drawn beyond Belgium's borders. He believed that for Belgium to truly prosper and secure its place among the great powers of Europe, it needed to expand its influence overseas. Leopold was acutely aware of how other European nations, particularly Britain and France, had enriched themselves through colonial ventures. He saw colonialism not just as a path to national greatness, but as an economic necessity for Belgium. Leopold's interest in colonialism was not new. Even before becoming king, he had written extensively on the subject and had closely followed the colonial activities of other European powers. In his private writings, we see Leopold's growing obsession with acquiring colonial territory. He once wrote, "I do not want to miss a good chance of getting us a slice of this magnificent African cake." However, Leopold faced a significant obstacle to his colonial ambitions. The Belgian people and government showed little interest in overseas expansion. Belgium was a small, neutral country, focused on maintaining its independence in a Europe dominated by larger powers. The idea of colonial expansion seemed risky and unnecessary to many Belgians. Undeterred by this lack of enthusiasm, Leopold began to explore ways to pursue his colonial dreams independently of the Belgian government. What Leopold would eventually do was unprecedented. He would seek to acquire colonial territory not for Belgium, but for himself personally. This required careful maneuvering both legally and diplomatically. As the 1870s progressed, Leopold's attention increasingly turned to Africa, particularly the vast, largely unexplored region of the Congo Basin. The Congo Basin was one of the last blank spaces on the map of Africa. It was known to be rich in resources, but its interior remained largely a mystery to Europeans. Leopold saw in the Congo an opportunity to fulfill his colonial ambitions. He began to lay the groundwork for what would become one of the most audacious and ultimately tragic colonial ventures in history. What's crucial to understand is that Leopold's interest in the Congo was never about benefiting the Congolese people or even, primarily, about benefiting Belgium. It was about creating a personal empire, one that would bring him wealth and prestige. As Leopold II set his sights on Africa, he was far from alone. The latter half of the 19th century saw a frenzy of European colonial activity on the African continent, a period known as the Scramble for Africa. The Scramble for Africa was an unprecedented land grab. Between 1881 and 1914, European powers went from controlling roughly 10% of Africa to nearly 90%. The motivations were complex. Economic interests, national prestige, and a misguided sense of racial and cultural superiority all played a role. Leopold II, however, faced a unique challenge. Unlike the rulers of other European powers, he did not have the full support of his government or people in his colonial ambitions. Belgium was a constitutional monarchy, and the government was wary of the costs and risks associated with colonialism. Leopold had to find a way to pursue his African dreams without directly involving the Belgian state. The king's solution was both ingenious and devious. He would present his venture into Africa as a philanthropic and scientific mission, while secretly working to secure personal control over vast territories. In 1876, Leopold convened a conference in Brussels, ostensibly to discuss the civilization of Africa and the suppression of the slave trade. This led to the formation of the International African Association, with Leopold as its chairman. The association presented itself as a humanitarian organization dedicated to scientific exploration and the improvement of African peoples. In reality, it was a vehicle for Leopold's colonial ambitions. It's crucial to understand the context of the time. The language of civilizing missions and humanitarian intervention was often used to justify colonial expansion. Leopold was particularly adept at manipulating this rhetoric to his advantage. To further his goals, Leopold enlisted the services of the famous explorer Henry Morton Stanley. Stanley had already made a name for himself with his expeditions in Africa, particularly his search for Dr. David Livingstone. Leopold saw in Stanley the perfect agent to establish a presence in the Congo Basin. Between 1879 and 1884, Stanley undertook expeditions to the Congo on Leopold's behalf. Officially, these were scientific missions. In reality, Stanley was securing land concessions from local chiefs, often through deception or coercion. The treaties Stanley obtained were deeply problematic. Many African leaders didn't understand the European concept of exclusive land ownership, and the documents were often in languages they couldn't read. While Stanley was at work in Africa, Leopold was busy in Europe, lobbying governments and influential individuals to support his venture. Leopold's diplomatic efforts were remarkable. He managed to convince major powers, including the United States, that his intentions in the Congo were purely philanthropic. He presented himself as a disinterested party who could be trusted to oversee the region's development. The king's efforts culminated in the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, a meeting that would reshape the map of Africa. The Berlin Conference was ostensibly called to set rules for European colonization of Africa. In reality, it was about dividing the continent among the European powers. Remarkably, no African representatives were present. Through skillful maneuvering and lobbying, Leopold achieved a stunning diplomatic victory at the conference. The major powers agreed to recognize Leopold's claim to the Congo Basin, not as a Belgian colony, but as his own personal property. This was unprecedented in the history of international relations. On May 29, 1885, Leopold's new possession was officially recognized. He named it the Congo Free State. The use of the term Free State was deeply ironic. In reality, the Congo was neither free nor a state in any meaningful sense. It was Leopold's private property, and he had near absolute power over its territory and inhabitants. The Congo Free State encompassed an area of over 2.3 million square kilometers, about 76 times the size of Belgium. Its population was estimated at 20 to 30 million people. To put this in perspective, Leopold now personally controlled a territory larger than France, Germany, Norway, Sweden, and Italy combined. It was an empire hiding behind the facade of a humanitarian project. With the Congo Free State established, Leopold was poised to begin exploiting its vast natural resources. But few could have predicted the scale of the horror that was about to unfold. The creation of the Congo Free State marked the beginning of one of the most brutal episodes in colonial history. Leopold had achieved his dream of a personal colony, but for the people of the Congo, a nightmare was just beginning. With international recognition secured, Leopold wasted no time in establishing his control over the vast territory of the Congo Free State. The transformation from a supposedly philanthropic venture to a brutal system of exploitation was swift and merciless. It's crucial to understand that the Congo Free State was not a colony in the traditional sense. It was Leopold's personal property, and he had absolute control over its administration and resources. Leopold's first task was to create an administrative structure that would allow him to exert control over this enormous territory. The king established a two-tiered system of governance. At the top was the central administration in Brussels, staffed by Leopold's most trusted advisors. On the ground in Congo, a network of district commissioners was put in place, each with near absolute power in their respective regions. To enforce his will, Leopold created the Force Publique, a private army at his disposal. The Force Publique was a mix of Belgian officers and African soldiers. It was ostensibly created to maintain order and fight Arab slave traders, but in reality, it became the instrument of Leopold's oppressive regime. The early years of the Congo Free State were marked by exploration and the establishment of infrastructure to facilitate resource extraction. Leopold invested heavily in transportation, particularly in steamboats and a railway line to bypass the treacherous rapids of the lower Congo River. These were not for the benefit of the Congolese, but to enable the efficient export of ivory and later rubber. While Leopold portrayed the Congo Free State as a civilizing mission to the outside world, the reality on the ground was starkly different. The Congolese people, who had lived on this land for millennia, suddenly found themselves subjects of a distant monarch who viewed them as little more than a resource to be exploited. Leopold's agents began to impose a system of forced labor, initially focused on ivory collection. Ivory was the first major export of the Congo Free State. African elephants were hunted to near extinction, and local populations were coerced into collecting and transporting the tusks. However, It was the discovery of wild rubber that would truly shape the brutal nature of Leopold's rule. The Congo Basin was rich in rubber vines. As the global demand for rubber skyrocketed due to the invention of the pneumatic tire, Leopold saw an opportunity for immense profits. To exploit this resource, Leopold instituted a quota system that would have devastating consequences for the Congolese people. Each village was assigned an impossible quota of rubber to collect. Failure to meet these quotas resulted in severe punishments, including mutilation, torture, and death. The methods used to enforce these quotas were shockingly brutal. Forced public soldiers would hold women and children hostage, only releasing them when the men of the village brought in the required amount of rubber. Entire communities were wiped out if they resisted or failed to meet quotas. As news of the atrocities began to trickle out of the Congo, Leopold doubled down on his efforts to portray the Free State as a humanitarian endeavor. Leopold created a sophisticated propaganda machine. He funded expeditions, published favorable reports, and even created a press bureau to manage the Free State's image internationally. Despite these efforts, eyewitness accounts of the horrors in Congo began to emerge, setting the stage for what would become one of the first international human rights campaigns. Missionaries, traders, and even some of Leopold's own agents began to speak out about what they had seen. These accounts would eventually reach a global audience and spark widespread outrage. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Congo Free State had become a well-oiled machine of exploitation. Millions of Congolese were suffering under a system of forced labor, while Leopold's personal fortune grew exponentially. It's estimated that Leopold extracted wealth equivalent to billions of dollars in today's money from the Congo. This funded lavish building projects in Belgium and expanded his personal holdings significantly. The establishment of the Congo Free State represents a dark chapter in colonial history, one where the rhetoric of civilization and progress masked a reality of unimaginable cruelty and exploitation. What happened in the Congo was not unique in the context of European colonialism, but the scale of the atrocities and the fact that this was essentially one man's private enterprise set it apart. The Congo Free State was, at its core, an economic enterprise. Leopold's primary goal was to extract as much wealth as possible from the vast territory under his control. The methods employed to achieve this aim would lead to one of the most brutal episodes of colonial exploitation in history. Initially, the main export from the Congo was ivory. African elephants were hunted relentlessly, decimating the population. But it was the discovery of wild rubber that truly transformed the economic landscape of the Congo Free State. In the late 19th century, the invention of the pneumatic tire led to a global rubber boom. The Congo, with its vast forests of rubber vines, was perfectly positioned to meet this demand. The rubber vines of the Congo, primarily of the genus Landolphia, were not cultivated but grew wild in the rainforest. Extracting the latex was a labor-intensive process that required workers to make deep incisions in the vines and collect the dripping sap. To maximize profits, Leopold implemented a brutal system of forced labor. The regime established impossibly high quotas for rubber collection. Each village was required to deliver a set amount of rubber, and the consequences for failing to meet these quotas were severe. The force public, Leopold's private army, was tasked with enforcing these quotas. They employed horrific tactics, including torture, mutilation, and murder, to ensure compliance. One of the most infamous practices was the amputation of hands. Forced public soldiers were required to account for every bullet they used. To prove they hadn't wasted ammunition on hunting or personal use, they would cut off the hands of their victims, including children, as proof of a kill. The rubber quotas had a devastating impact on Congolese society. Entire villages were depopulated as men fled into the forest to avoid conscription into rubber collection. This led to widespread famine, as agricultural production collapsed. Women and children were often held hostage to force the men to meet their quotas. The economic impact of this system was staggering, both for the Congo and for Leopold personally. At its peak, the Congo Free State was producing over 6,000 tons of rubber annually, accounting for nearly half of the world's supply. The profits were enormous, with estimates suggesting Leopold personally amassed a fortune equivalent to billions in today's currency. This wealth funded lavish projects in Belgium and expanded Leopold's personal holdings. Leopold used his Congo profits to finance numerous building projects, including the Royal Greenhouses of Laeken, the Cinquantenaire Arch in Brussels, and the Royal Museum for Central Africa. These structures stand today as reminders of the human cost of Leopold's ambition. The rubber boom also led to significant infrastructure development in the Congo, but this was solely to facilitate resource extraction. A vast network of river steamers was established, along with the construction of the Matadi-Leopoldville Railway. While these projects were impressive feats of engineering, they were built at an enormous human cost and were not designed to benefit the Congolese people. As rubber production increased, so did the brutality of the regime. The system created a culture of violence and impunity. European agents in the Congo were incentivized to extract maximum profits, leading to ever-increasing atrocities against the local population. The rubber boom had profound environmental consequences as well. The intensive exploitation of wild rubber vines led to their near extinction in many areas. This, combined with the disruption of traditional agricultural practices, had long-lasting effects on the Congo's ecosystems. While rubber was the primary focus, other resources were also exploited. The Congo's vast mineral wealth, including copper, gold, and diamonds, began to be extracted during this period. This laid the groundwork for future exploitation that continues to this day. The economic exploitation of the Congo Free State was not just about resource extraction. It also involved a complex system of trade and finance. Leopold created a monopoly system where only approved companies could operate in the Congo. These companies were often directly or indirectly controlled by the king himself, ensuring that profits flowed into his personal coffers. The impact of this economic system on the Congolese people was catastrophic. It's estimated that the population of the Congo decreased by up to 50% during Leopold's rule. Millions died from violence, disease, starvation, and exhaustion. Entire communities were wiped out in the pursuit of rubber. The economic exploitation of the Congo Free State represents one of the most extreme examples of colonial extraction in history. It was a system designed to enrich one man at the cost of millions of lives. What sets the Congo Free State apart is not just the scale of the atrocities, but the fact that this was essentially a private enterprise. Leopold had turned an area 76 times the size of Belgium into his personal fiefdom, and he exploited it with a ruthlessness that shocked even his colonial contemporaries. The atrocities committed under Leopold's rule were so severe that they would eventually lead to international condemnation and intervention. What occurred in the Congo Free State was not just colonial exploitation, but a systematic campaign of violence and intimidation designed to maximize profit at any human cost. The most infamous aspect of this brutal regime was the practice of mutilation, particularly the amputation of hands. The cutting off of hands became a symbol of the Congo Free State's cruelty. It was initially used as a punishment for not meeting rubber quotas and as proof that ammunition had been used to kill rather than wasted. Survivors recounted horrific experiences. One such account states, "They came to our village demanding rubber. When we couldn't provide enough, they took my father. They cut off his hand in front of us. He bled to death as an example to others." The practice of mutilation was not limited to hands. Ears, noses, and other body parts were also severed as punishment or intimidation. The victims who survived these mutilations often died later from infection or inability to work. Those who lived were permanently disfigured and often ostracized from their communities. Another common tactic was the taking of hostages, particularly women and children. Forced public soldiers would enter a village and take the women and children hostage. The men were then forced to go into the forest to collect rubber, knowing that their families would be killed or tortured if they failed to meet the quotas. The destruction of entire villages was another horrific aspect of Leopold's regime. If a village resisted or repeatedly failed to meet quotas, it was not uncommon for the entire community to be wiped out. Houses were burned, crops destroyed, and inhabitants massacred. This was done to instill fear and ensure compliance in neighboring areas. The forced labor system led to widespread famine and disease. As men were forced to spend weeks in the forest collecting rubber, agricultural production collapsed. This, combined with the deliberate destruction of crops as punishment, led to widespread malnutrition and starvation. Diseases, particularly sleeping sickness, ravaged the weakened population. The disruption of traditional societies, forced relocations, and the general chaos of the rubber trade created perfect conditions for the spread of diseases. Sleeping sickness, in particular, reached epidemic proportions. The impact on Congolese society and culture was devastating. Traditional power structures were dismantled, religious practices disrupted, and entire languages and cultures were lost as communities were destroyed or displaced. The trauma inflicted during this period continues to affect Congolese society to this day. The brutality was not limited to the Congolese. Even European agents who showed sympathy to the local population faced severe consequences. There are accounts of European agents being murdered or driven to suicide after reporting abuses or refusing to participate in the brutal regime. The system rewarded cruelty and punished compassion. The scale of the atrocities was staggering. It's estimated that the population of the Congo decreased by 10 to 15 million people during Leopold's rule. This was due to a combination of murder, starvation, exhaustion, exposure, disease, and a plummeting birth rate. The psychological impact of living under such a regime of terror is almost unimaginable. Entire generations were traumatized, leading to long-lasting effects on Congolese society. As news of these atrocities began to spread, eyewitness accounts emerged that shocked the world. One journalist reported, "I have seen these things done and have watched the system work. I have seen the bleeding, mutilated victims of red rubber, and I have seen dead bodies by the roadside." Missionaries, in particular, played a crucial role in exposing the abuses. Missionaries like William Shepherd and John Harris risked their lives to document and report on the atrocities they witnessed. Their accounts, often accompanied by photographs, were instrumental in raising awareness internationally. The use of photography was particularly effective in bringing the horrors of the Congo Free State to light. Photographs of mutilated Congolese, especially children, had a profound impact on public opinion. These images made the abstract concept of colonial abuse viscerally real to people in Europe and America. The atrocities in the Congo Free State represented a new level of colonial brutality, even by the standards of the time. While violence and exploitation were common in many colonial regimes, the systematic nature and sheer scale of the abuses in the Congo set it apart. It was colonialism taken to its most extreme and brutal conclusion. The legacy of these atrocities continues to haunt the Democratic Republic of Congo to this day. The trauma inflicted during Leopold's rule created deep-seated issues that have contributed to the ongoing instability and conflict in the region. The exploitation of the Congo's resources by external powers, which began under Leopold, continues in various forms to this day. The atrocities committed in the Congo Free State stand as one of the most egregious examples of human rights abuses in modern history. They serve as a stark reminder of the potential for cruelty when power is unchecked and human life is valued less than profit. The story of the Congo Free State is not just history. It's a cautionary tale about the consequences of unbridled greed and the importance of international vigilance in protecting human rights. As the 19th century drew to a close, the veil of secrecy surrounding the Congo Free State began to lift. Reports of atrocities trickled out, slowly at first, then in a flood that would shock the conscience of the world. The first criticisms of Leopold's regime came from unexpected quarters. Some of the earliest voices of dissent were raised by the very people Leopold had employed to help run his colony. One of these early whistleblowers was Edmund Dean Morrell, a British shipping clerk who worked for a Liverpool shipping line that had a contract with the Congo Free State. Morrell noticed discrepancies in the shipping manifests. Ships arriving from the Congo were full of valuable rubber and ivory, but those heading to the Congo carried little more than weapons and ammunition. He realized this could only mean one thing: slave labor on a massive scale. Morrell's suspicions were confirmed by others who had witnessed the atrocities firsthand. Missionaries played a crucial role in exposing the abuses in the Congo. Their eyewitness accounts, often accompanied by photographs, provided irrefutable evidence of Leopold's brutal regime. Missionaries like William Shepherd, John and Alice Harris, and George Washington Williams were among the first to document and publicize the atrocities. Their reports, sent back to Europe and America, began to turn public opinion against Leopold. As these reports accumulated, they caught the attention of diplomats and government officials. In 1903, the British government sent their consul in the Congo, Roger Casement, to investigate the allegations. His report, published in 1904, was damning. Casement wrote, "The root of the evil lies in the fact that the government of the Congo is above all a commercial trust, that everything else is orientated towards commercial gain." Casement's report provided official confirmation of what missionaries and others had been saying for years. It was a turning point in the campaign against Leopold's rule. The publication of Casement's report made it impossible for other governments to ignore the situation in the Congo. It put pressure on Belgium to take action and galvanize public opinion in Britain and the United States. The growing outrage led to the formation of the Congo Reform Association in 1904, founded by E.D. Morrell and supported by prominent figures like Mark Twain and Arthur Conan Doyle. The Congo Reform Association was one of the first international human rights organizations. It used modern publicity techniques, including photographs, pamphlets, and public lectures, to raise awareness of the Congo atrocities. Mark Twain, the famous American author, became one of the most vocal critics of Leopold's regime. Twain's satirical pamphlet King Leopold's Soliloquy was a scathing indictment of the Belgian monarch. In it, Twain imagined Leopold defending his actions in a monologue dripping with sarcasm and bitter irony. Twain wrote in Leopold's voice, "The Congo state is my private property. I have the right to do in my Congo whatever I will. It is nobody's business but my own." The international campaign against Leopold's rule in the Congo was remarkable for its time. This was one of the first instances of a global human rights campaign using mass media to sway public opinion. The use of photography, in particular, was revolutionary. Images of mutilated Congolese, especially children, had a profound impact on the public. The pressure on Leopold continued to mount. In 1905, Leopold was forced to appoint an independent commission of inquiry. The commission's report, while somewhat watered down, still confirmed many of the allegations. It was another blow to Leopold's credibility and strengthened the case for reform. In the United States, the campaign against Leopold gained significant traction. The American Congo Reform Association, led by figures like Booker T. Washington, lobbied the U.S. government to take action. In 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt publicly criticized the situation in the Congo. Despite mounting evidence and growing international pressure, Leopold fought back with a sophisticated propaganda campaign. Leopold established a press bureau to counter negative reports. He funded expeditions, published favorable accounts, and even bribed journalists and politicians to defend his regime. However, the tide of public opinion had decisively turned against Leopold. By 1908, the pressure on both Leopold and the Belgian government had become overwhelming. It was clear that the Congo Free State could not continue in its current form. The international reaction to the Congo atrocities marked a significant moment in the history of human rights. This campaign set important precedents for future human rights movements. It demonstrated the power of public opinion to influence international affairs and the importance of documentation and media in exposing abuses. The exposure of Leopold's brutal regime in the Congo was a triumph of investigative journalism, missionary zeal, and humanitarian activism. It forced the world to confront the dark reality of colonial exploitation and set the stage for the end of Leopold's personal rule in the Congo. However, it's important to note that while the campaign succeeded in ending the worst excesses of Leopold's rule, it did not end colonial exploitation in the Congo. The legacy of this period would continue to shape the region's history for decades to come. As international criticism mounted, Leopold II launched a sophisticated and far-reaching propaganda campaign to defend his rule in the Congo Free State. This marked one of the earliest examples of a modern public relations effort to shape global opinion. Leopold's propaganda machine was remarkably advanced for its time. He employed a variety of tactics that we would recognize in modern PR campaigns, controlling the narrative, discrediting opponents, and presenting alternative facts. Central to Leopold's efforts was the establishment of the Press Bureau in 1903. The Press Bureau was tasked with producing and disseminating pro-Leopold literature, bribing journalists and intimidating critics. It was in essence an early version of a modern PR firm, but with the resources of a state behind it. Leopold's propaganda efforts extended far beyond simple press releases. The king funded expeditions to the Congo, carefully managing to show only what he wanted the world to see. He commissioned books, articles, and even works of art that portrayed his rule in the Congo as benevolent and progressive. Photographers were instructed to capture images of smiling Congolese, modern infrastructure, and thriving plantations. Any signs of the brutal reality were strictly off-limits. One of Leopold's key propaganda tactics was to present himself as a philanthropist and anti-slavery crusader. Leopold created the impression that his primary motive in the Congo was to end the Arab slave trade. This narrative appealed to many in Europe and America who saw Leopold as a force for civilization in Africa. To bolster this image, Leopold established the International African Association, ostensibly a scientific and humanitarian organization. The association was presented as a noble endeavor to bring enlightenment to Africa. In reality, it was a front for Leopold's colonial ambitions, but it served its purpose in garnering international support. Leopold also sought to discredit his critics, often in highly personal ways. The king's agents spread rumors about the personal lives and motivations of reformers like E.D. Morel and Roger Casement. They were portrayed as unpatriotic, mentally unstable, or driven by personal grudges. When confronted with evidence of atrocities, Leopold's strategy was often to deny, deflect, or minimize. Leopold would say, "These so-called atrocities are greatly exaggerated." Mistakes may have been made, as they are in any large enterprise, but our intentions in the Congo have always been, and remain, honorable. The king also attempted to use legal means to silence his critics. Leopold threatened libel suits against newspapers and individuals who published critical accounts of his rule in the Congo. While these threats were often not followed through, they had a chilling effect on some potential critics. In response to growing pressure, Leopold established several commissions of inquiry. These commissions were carefully managed to produce results favorable to Leopold. While they acknowledged some abuses, they often downplayed their extent and shifted blame away from the king's policies. Leopold's propaganda efforts extended to the realms of culture and education. The Royal Museum for Central Africa, established by Leopold in 1898, was a masterpiece of colonial propaganda. It presented a sanitized version of Belgian activities in the Congo, portraying colonialism as a civilizing mission. Despite the sophistication of Leopold's propaganda efforts, they ultimately failed to stem the tide of criticism. The sheer volume and credibility of the evidence against Leopold's regime eventually overwhelmed his attempts at image management. Photographs of mutilated Congolese, in particular, were difficult to explain away. As pressure mounted, Leopold's defenses became increasingly desperate. In his later statements, we see a man unable to confront the reality of what he had created. Leopold seems to have convinced himself of his own propaganda, truly believing he was a misunderstood benefactor to the Congo. Leopold's final line of defense was to appeal to colonial rivalries and economic interests. The king argued that criticisms of his rule were motivated by the jealousy of other colonial powers, particularly Britain. He warned that any change in the Congo's status would harm European economic interests. Despite these efforts, by 1908, it was clear that Leopold's personal rule in the Congo was no longer tenable. The combination of international pressure, domestic opposition in Belgium, and the financial strains of maintaining the Congo Free State forced Leopold to consider transferring control to the Belgian state. Leopold's propaganda campaign represents a dark chapter in the history of public relations. It demonstrates the power of narrative control and the dangers of unchecked information manipulation. The Congo Free State propaganda effort serves as a cautionary tale. It shows how even the most horrific abuses can be obfuscated and justified through sophisticated PR techniques. Ultimately, Leopold's propaganda failed because reality was too brutal to be hidden forever. But the tactics he pioneered, controlling information, attacking critics, creating alternative narratives, continue to be used by those seeking to avoid accountability for human rights abuses. As Leopold's propaganda efforts faltered, the campaign for Congo reform gained unstoppable momentum. This movement, spanning continents and social classes, would ultimately force the Belgian king to relinquish his personal colony. The Congo Reform Association, founded by Edi Morel in 1904, became the focal point of international efforts to end Leopold's rule in the Congo. It was one of the first global human rights movements of the 20th century. Edi Morel was a formidable campaigner. He wrote countless articles, gave lectures across Europe and America, and coordinated a network of activists. His book, Red Rubber, published in 1906, became a damning indictment of Leopold's regime. The reform movement employed innovative tactics for its time. They used photographs of mutilated Congolese, particularly children, to shock the public conscience. These images, circulated in newspapers and pamphlets, made the abstract concept of colonial abuse viscerally real to people in Europe and America. The campaign attracted support from prominent figures across the world. Writers like Mark Twain and Arthur Conan Doyle lent their pens to the cause. Twain's satirical pamphlet King Leopold's Soliloquy was particularly effective in exposing the king's hypocrisy. In the United States, the movement gained significant traction. Booker T. Washington, the prominent African-American educator, became a key figure in the American Congo Reform Association. His involvement helped to frame the Congo atrocities as not just a colonial issue, but a racial one. The campaign also found allies in unexpected places. Some of Leopold's own former employees became whistleblowers. Men like Roger Casement, who had initially gone to the Congo in Leopold's service, became some of the most damning witnesses against the regime. As public opinion turned against Leopold, pressure mounted on governments to take action. The British government, in particular, faced increasing calls to intervene. Questions were raised in Parliament, and the Foreign Office was forced to take a more active stance on the Congo issue. In Belgium itself, opposition to Leopold's personal rule was growing. Many Belgians were uncomfortable with the idea of their king owning a personal colony. Socialists and other progressive groups began to call for the Congo to be brought under state control. The financial strain of maintaining the Congo Free State also played a role in its downfall. By 1905, the Congo Free State was deeply in debt. Leopold had mortgaged much of its future revenue to finance his lavish building projects in Belgium. This financial precariousness made the idea of state takeover more appealing to the Belgian government. As pressure mounted from all sides, Leopold finally began to consider relinquishing control of the Congo. Leopold realized that his position was becoming untenable. However, he was determined to negotiate terms that would be favorable to him personally. Negotiations for the transfer of the Congo to Belgian state control began in earnest in 1908. The talks were complex, involving not just the Belgian government and Leopold, but also other powers with interests in the Congo, particularly Britain and Germany. Leopold drove a hard bargain, despite his weakened position. The king insisted on a substantial financial settlement. He also demanded that the Belgian state take on the Congo Free State's considerable debts. On November 15, 1908, the Congo Free State officially became the Belgian Congo. The Belgian parliament voted to annex the Congo, ending Leopold's personal rule. However, the colonial system remained largely intact, with many of the same officials staying in their positions. The financial terms of the transfer were generous to Leopold. The king received 50 million francs as a mark of gratitude for his great sacrifices made for the Congo. He was also allowed to retain vast personal holdings in the colony through the Domaine de la Couronne. The transfer of the Congo to Belgian control was met with mixed reactions. While many celebrated the end of Leopold's personal fiefdom, others remained skeptical. One activist noted, "While we celebrate the end of Leopold's personal fiefdom, we must remain vigilant. The system of exploitation remains, only now it is in the hands of the Belgian state." Indeed, while the worst excesses of Leopold's rule were curbed, the fundamental nature of colonial exploitation in the Congo did not immediately change. For many Congolese, the transfer from Leopold to Belgium made little difference in their daily lives. The structures of oppression remained, even if their ultimate master had changed. The campaign for Congo reform and the eventual transfer of the colony to Belgian control marked a significant moment in the history of human rights and international relations. This was one of the first instances where international public opinion forced a sovereign monarch to relinquish control of a territory. It set important precedents for future human rights campaigns. However, it's crucial to note that while Leopold's personal rule ended, colonialism in the Congo did not. The Belgian Congo would continue to exploit the region's resources and people for another 5 decades. The shadow of Leopold's rule over the Congo Free State stretches far beyond its official end in 1908. Its impact continues to shape the Democratic Republic of Congo and our understanding of colonial history to this day. The legacy of Leopold's rule is complex and multifaceted. It affected not just the Congo, but Belgium, the broader African continent, and the global discourse on human rights and colonialism. Perhaps the most immediate and devastating impact was on Congolese society and culture. Leopold's regime caused a demographic catastrophe. Estimates suggest that the population of the Congo was reduced by up to 50% during his rule. This loss of life had profound and lasting effects on Congolese social structures, cultural practices, and traditional knowledge systems. The forced labor system and violent suppression of resistance disrupted family structures and community bonds. Many Congolese were displaced from their ancestral lands, leading to a loss of connection to traditional ways of life. The economic impact of Leopold's rule set the stage for decades of exploitation. Leopold's regime established a model of resource extraction that prioritized foreign profits over local development. This pattern continued under Belgian state rule and, in many ways, persists in the modern DRC's relationship with multinational corporations. The environmental consequences of Leopold's rule were also significant and long-lasting. The intensive rubber harvesting led to the near extinction of wild rubber vines in many areas. This, combined with ivory hunting and later mining operations, caused lasting damage to Congo's ecosystems. In Belgium, Leopold's rule left a complicated legacy. For many years, Leopold II was portrayed in Belgium as a great builder and visionary. Many of the grand buildings and public works he financed with Congo profits still stand in Brussels and other Belgian cities. The Royal Museum for Central Africa, the Cinquantenaire Arch, and the Royal Greenhouses of Laeken are all testaments to Leopold's ambition. However, they now serve as uncomfortable reminders of the source of their funding. In recent years, Belgium has begun to grapple more openly with this dark chapter of its history. There have been calls to remove or contextualize statues of Leopold II, rename streets and public spaces bearing his name, and revise school curricula to more accurately reflect the realities of Belgian colonialism. The Congo Free State also left its mark on international relations and diplomacy. The international campaign against Leopold's rule was one of the first global human rights movements. It set important precedents for how public opinion could influence state actions in matters of international concern. The exposure of atrocities in the Congo played a role in the development of international human rights law. It contributed to evolving notions of universal human rights that would later be codified in documents like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In the realm of historical study, Leopold's rule has become a key case study in examinations of colonialism. The Congo Free State represents an extreme example of colonial exploitation. Its study has contributed to more nuanced understandings of the economic motivations behind colonialism and the mechanisms of colonial control. The legacy of Leopold's rule continues to affect the Democratic Republic of Congo's political and economic realities. The artificial borders drawn during the colonial era, which ignored ethnic and cultural boundaries, have contributed to ongoing conflicts in the region. The centralized extractive state structure established under Leopold has proven difficult to reform. The Congo's vast mineral wealth, first systematically exploited under Leopold, continues to be a source of both opportunity and conflict. The country struggles with what some call the resource curse, where abundant natural resources paradoxically contribute to economic and political instability. The psychological impact of Leopold's rule on the Congolese people has been profound and long-lasting. The trauma inflicted during this period has been passed down through generations. It has contributed to a complex relationship with authority, persistent feelings of exploitation by outside forces, and challenges in nation-building. In the broader context of African history, the Congo Free State stands as a stark example of colonial brutality. While other colonial regimes were also exploitative, the extent of the atrocities in the Congo Free State made it a uniquely horrific case. It has become a powerful symbol of the devastating potential of unchecked colonial power. The story of the Congo Free State has also left its mark on popular culture. Works like Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, inspired by the author's experiences in the Congo, have shaped popular perceptions of Africa and colonialism. However, these narratives have also been criticized for perpetuating problematic stereotypes. In recent years, there have been growing calls for reparations and formal apologies. While Belgium has expressed regret for the suffering inflicted during the colonial period, it has stopped short of a formal apology or reparations. This remains a point of contention in Belgium-DRC relations. The legacy of Leopold's rule in the Congo is a reminder of the long shadows cast by historical injustices. It challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths about the past and their ongoing implications in the present. Understanding this history is crucial not just for comprehending the challenges facing the modern DRC, but for grappling with the broader legacies of colonialism worldwide. It reminds us of the importance of vigilance against human rights abuses and the power of public opinion to effect change. As the Congo slipped from his grasp, Leopold II entered the twilight of his life. The final years of the king, who had once controlled a territory 76 times the size of Belgium, were marked by controversy, personal turmoil, and a desperate attempt to secure his legacy. The loss of the Congo was a severe blow to Leopold's ego and ambitions. Despite the enormous wealth he had extracted from the colony, he seemed to view himself as the wrong party in the affair. In his later years, Leopold became increasingly isolated, both politically and personally. The king's relationship with the Belgian government was strained. Many politicians viewed him as a liability, especially after the Congo scandal. His family life was equally troubled, with strained relationships with his daughters and a scandalous affair with a young prostitute-turned-baroness, Caroline Lacroix. Leopold's relationship with Caroline Lacroix was particularly controversial. The king met Caroline when she was just 16 and he was 65. Their relationship caused outrage in Belgian society, especially when Leopold began using his Congo wealth to shower her with gifts and property. As his health declined, Leopold became obsessed with his place in history. We see in Leopold's later actions a man desperate to control how he would be remembered. He ordered the destruction of many of his personal papers and archives, particularly those related to the Congo. On December 12, 1909, the king ordered his private secretary to burn many of his personal documents. This destruction of evidence has made it challenging for historians to fully uncover the extent of Leopold's personal involvement in the Congo atrocities. Despite his efforts at historical revisionism, Leopold's reputation was irreparably damaged. By the end of his reign, Leopold was a deeply unpopular figure in Belgium. His lavish spending, controversial personal life, and the stain of the Congo had eroded much of the respect traditionally afforded to the monarchy. Leopold II died on December 17, 1909, at the age of 74. The king's health had been declining for years. He suffered from a variety of ailments, including arthritis and a stroke. In the end, he succumbed to pneumonia. The king's death was met with mixed reactions in Belgium and around the world. One journalist wrote, "The passing of King Leopold II marks the end of a controversial reign." While some mourn the loss of a monarch who oversaw Belgium's industrial growth, others see his death as the final chapter in a dark period of colonial exploitation. Leopold's funeral was a somber and relatively muted affair. The funeral procession was met with silence from many onlookers, a stark contrast to the cheering crowds that had greeted Leopold at his coronation. It was a reflection of how far the king's reputation had fallen. In his will, Leopold made several controversial bequests. The king left much of his Congo-derived wealth to Caroline Lacroix and her two sons by Leopold. This infuriated his daughters, who contested the will, leading to a protracted legal battle. Leopold was succeeded by his nephew, Albert I, who faced the challenging task of restoring the monarchy's reputation. Albert took a markedly different approach from his uncle. He emphasized modesty, duty, and constitutional monarchy. This helped to stabilize the Belgian royal family's position after the tumultuous Leopold years. In the immediate aftermath of Leopold's death, there were efforts to reshape his legacy. The Belgian establishment attempted to focus on Leopold's domestic achievements, such as his urban development projects. However, the shadow of the Congo loomed large over any attempts at rehabilitation. Internationally, Leopold's death was seen as the final act in the Congo Free State tragedy. While the Congo had already been transferred to Belgian state control, Leopold's death was seen by many as the true end of an era. It allowed for a degree of closure, though the impacts of his rule would continue to be felt for generations. In the Congo itself, the news of Leopold's death was received with little fanfare. For most Congolese, Leopold had been a distant, malevolent figure. His death changed little in their daily lives, as the structures of colonial exploitation remained firmly in place under Belgian state rule. The immediate post-Leopold period saw some reforms in the Congo, but the fundamental nature of colonial rule remained unchanged. One colonial administrator noted, "We have made efforts to improve conditions for the natives, but we must remember that our primary duty is to make the Congo profitable for Belgium." The methods may have changed, but the mission remains the same. In Belgium, there were debates about how to remember Leopold II. Many of the buildings and monuments Leopold had constructed with Congo wealth became subjects of controversy. There were discussions about whether to remove his statues or add contextual information about his colonial atrocities. Academically, Leopold's death opened up new avenues for studying the Congo Free State. With the king gone, more people felt free to speak about what had happened in the Congo. This led to a wealth of new testimonies and documents coming to light, though many crucial records have been destroyed on Leopold's orders. The legal battles over Leopold's will dragged on for years, a fitting coda to a life marked by greed and controversy. The dispute over Leopold's estate lasted until 1914. It was one of the most complex and contentious probate cases in Belgian history, involving not just family members, but also the Belgian state and Leopold's many creditors. The death of Leopold II marked the end of a dark chapter in both Belgian and Congolese history. However, it was far from the end of the story. Leopold's legacy would continue to shape Belgium's relationship with its former colony for decades to come. The structures of exploitation he put in place proved remarkably durable, outlasting not just the king, but the entire colonial system. The story of Leopold II and the Congo Free State remains a powerful reminder of the potential for human cruelty and the importance of international vigilance against human rights abuses. It challenges us to confront the darker aspects of our shared history and to strive for justice and accountability. In the end, Leopold's regime left a lasting legacy of exploitation and suffering in the Congo. The country was left to pick up the pieces, and the scars of colonialism still linger today. The story of King Leopold II and the Congo Free State serves as a stark reminder of the horrors of colonialism and the devastating impact it had on the people and the region. What are your thoughts on colonialism and its lasting impact on regions like the Congo? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you're interested in exploring more historical topics, consider subscribing and be sure to check out our next video. Thanks for watching.